Welcome into AWA Unleashed. We are the number one self-proclaimed preeminent podcast that's dedicated to telling the stories and reliving the memories of the American Wrestling Association. My name is Chris Tubbs. I am the one that brings us in, but I am not the only one here. But as you can see right now, we've gone from six-man down to just a regular tag today. Polish show. I don't know where Mick at. Is that what the kids say? Where Mick at?
You know, Mick took a nasty bump this past Saturday at a wrestling event, follows that up with picking up a flu bug. And so I think he's back in the locker room, just as didn't want to come out for this fight. So not that it's going to be a fight. It's going to be a great show. But yeah, Mick, get better, get well. Sooner the better. We need you back on this podcast.
So if this is like wrestling, he's going to come out like halfway through all bandaged up, and all of a sudden we're going to see the camera come up. We're going to be, oh my gosh, it's Mick Carton. But no.
Well, it is the world of professional wrestling, so anything can happen.
Yes, it can. And for the next couple of weeks, you guys, we have got let me say, just based on the pictures that I've seen, and you'll see those if you're watching this on YouTube, you are going to see some pictures that are going to bring back some memories and some stories that I am really looking forward to hearing from the two individuals that we've got. We've got a combo deal the next couple of weeks. I'm super excited. But before that, let's get to some business. You see right up there, you see the 7th Avenue Pizza. You see them. Thank you so much to 7th Avenue Pizza and Matt and everybody there that they do a great job. It's the official pizza of AWA Unleashed. Check them out, 7thAvenuePizza.com. You can find it all over the Twin Cities. If you can't, hit me up on Twitter at CM Tubbs. Hit us up in the comments on YouTube or on Facebook, and we'll make sure that we get you hooked up. But, hey, you know, Joe, there were, I think it was the Lunch Byerly's in Edina, I want to say, but guess we're over in Edina, apparently, from what I've heard.
Edina's going blue collar on us. I love it.
Well, I mean, I think there's still a lot of cake. There's still a lot of cake, but yeah, I'm excited. So thank you guys for continuing to spread the word and associate us with the 7th Avenue Pizza as well. Do want to thank as well Soda Stick, because they are the official licensing partner. Can't believe it took me this long to say licensing partner. I like that. That sounds good. The official licensing partner of AWA Unleashed. And I mean, we go from hoodie season, which, by the way, if you want your hoodie with a personalized gimmick, as Mick would say, go to sodastickco.com, AWA Unleashed. You can get a black and white t-shirt. Those, you know, now as we're getting into, as they say, a hot boy or a hot girl summer, where you want to be looking pretty svelte. So we got t-shirts, we got all sorts of things. So I think we took care of the business, right?
We did, but one other thing that we certainly need to mention. By the time this is airing, it's going to be a couple of weeks since it's happened, but yet another loss in the professional wrestling world, and that was one Mr. Charlie Norris. Charlie had a good career in the business, well-respected, Native American. It went too soon. Was able to work with him on a couple of occasions and had nothing but respect for him. And he was a proud Native and stood strong for the Native American community. Charlie, rest in peace. 10 ring bells.
So even though it's not necessarily an AWA, connection, the upper Midwest, like, people know Charlie Norris, and people had a chance to see him in the early 90s in WCW. I believe it was Thunderbird Charlie Norris, I believe what he went as. So another unfortunate loss in the world of professional wrestling and the upper Midwest. All right, let's go ahead and transition, because we've got a couple guys that are standing by. And Joe, I think the AWA, number one, I think it was really strong when it came to tag teams. You can just look up and down the history of the AWA, and they had so many tag teams. But along with that, I think when we're talking about combinations, there were a lot of father and son combos. There were obviously the Gagnes. There were the Hennigs. I'm not going to give any more.
I'll even throw in the Lazowskis, Crusher and his son Larry Lazowski, who was a referee with the AWA.
Yes, but today we are fortunate to have these guys. People have been asking for these guys for a while, and I'm glad we were finally able to make it go, Joe.
Well, I am honored and privileged to introduce these two. One gentleman preceded me as the producer of the AWA. In fact, he was there from the very beginning. And there he is, Mr. Al DeRusha and his son, Gary DeRusha, long
Good morning.
AWA referee. How you guys doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Very good. Hey, you know, we've got time, but time is also precious. So I really want to get right into asking these questions. And Al, I had brought up that you were with the AWA from the very beginning when you were working at WTCN. But before we get into the wrestling, let's tell people about how you got started in television production.
Well, I was a senior in high school at Humboldt High School in St. Paul, and they had a senior work program where you would go to school in the morning, and then in the afternoon you would go on the job, so to speak, for on-the-job training. And you would work 2-3 months and then go back down to the bottom of the list, if you will, until every student had their job. Then you'd go back and they'd assign you to another job. And in 1953, in September, the work program teacher was going to give the next job up, which was at the TV station at that time, Channel 11, WMIN, in the Ham Building in St. Paul. And fortunately enough for me, the student didn't have a driver's license. So they said, Al, do you have a driver's license? And I said, I sure do. Well, I'll go over to the Ham Building and they'll hire you. I went there. They hired me as a office boy and driving a station wagon, picking up props and that kind of thing. And then the producer for the television station, Lloyd Balcom, said, would you like to work on the weekends in the studio, setting up lights and props and what have you? And I said, yeah, sure. So that eventually worked into full-time floor director. And from there, producer, director, staff director. And I did a lot of high school sports, basketball, hockey with Frank Butel and the Lou Nanny, Mr. Hockey. Anyway, in 1961, the AWA came to Channel 11 and they asked me to direct the program I did. That was in 1961, and in 73, I joined the AWA office full time, and I did ring announcing and refereeing, and not as much refereeing as my son Gary. But I did do a lot of refereeing, and that's really how I got into it. I was very blessed to move on, and it was a great career, and there isn't anything that I would have loved to have done any better than be with the AWA.
Well, I got to mention one show that, especially here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, that growing up, I watched all the time, and anybody that grew up in the 60s and 70s watched it. And that was the Casey Jones show with Roundhouse Rodney. And I just absolutely loved it. One thing that I did miss on Al's introduction, more not miss so much as we had to, we wanted to bring you guys in, but Al was inducted into the Minnesota Broadcasting Hall of Fame. You heard briefly about his career. You throw in Casey Jones and, of course, the AWA. And I was truly honored that you asked me to be there that night. Gary was there. Oh, yeah. Fantastic night. And it's why we're here today. It's why, Al, you're here today, and Gary, you're here today. Your career, Al, phenomenal, well-deserved induction into the Minnesota Broadcasting Hall of Fame. But we're here to talk about the AWA. And so, Chris, I know you've got a question about two of the big guys in the AWA that you'd like to hear some stories from Al about.
All right. I mean, I'm already just like, I'm loving this already. We're like 5 minutes in, and I'm already just like, because I'm talking to Al DeRusha. I mean, come on, he's a legend. I want to ask you, Al, when you got the call to work with the AWA, like, what was your relationship like with Verne and Wally?
Well, I worked a lot with Verne before I went into the office. And, Verne really, as Joe knows, was at every taping session when we did the taped wrestling. Marty O'Neill did the local play-by-play, if you will, and Roger Kent later on did the network. We were, a lot of fans think that maybe All-Star Wrestling was a local Minneapolis, St. Paul type wrestling show, but actually through Verne's efforts, we had a whole network. We were in about 22 major markets, Winnipeg, Chicago, Milwaukee, Denver, you name it. And the AWA was, looked like local. What we did was leave a 2-minute break in each one of the videotapes that we sent to the various markets. And then the local promoter would go on to the studio and do a 2-minute interview, and they would cut it into the tape. So if you're in Denver, you think it's Denver wrestling. Anyway, Verne was in the Olympics in 1948, and that's when he met Mad Dog Vachon. Mad Dog was in the Olympics at the same time with Verne, and Verne was on Chicago Dumont Network back in 48, 49. And he, of course, had the experience of wrestling. He knew it. He was a master at putting together matches. And Verne, at the time back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the AWA was the #1 wrestling promotion in the country. And Verne was a taskmaster, if you will. He insisted on
perfection.
And sometimes he would get a little carried away with the announcer and referee, and you had to do it Verne's way, or you wouldn't do it at all, really. And but Verne started it all. But when he bought the AWA franchise in Minneapolis from Tony Stecker, guess who was the man that was with Tony Stecker? Was Uncle Wally, Wally Karbo.
Yeah,
Dan. He was the buffer between Verne and the wrestlers, and the wrestlers would, like everything else, complain about not enough money and the payoffs weren't all that great, and they would go to Wally, and Wally would do a little clever figuring out and got him some more money, and Wally would say, "Well, it's not me; it's the other guy you talked to." Wally, I can't say enough about him. He was a character. I've got a list of some of the Wallyisms that the boys, we all call it Wallyisms, and he was. I don't want to say, if I tell some of the Wallyisms, you're going to think, oh my gosh, not very intelligent. But Wally was so passionate. He was so into the wrestling. It was his whole life. And he, he's Polish. God love him. Great. And we were doing interviews with Ivan Putski. And Marty would say, well, wrestling fans, we're going to call Ivan Putski in here. And he said, unfortunately, or fortunately, he's from Krakow, Poland, and speaks no English. So Marty says, but we're in luck. We got Wally Karbo, who speaks fluent Polish. So Wally comes in and Marty says, Wally, let's ask Ivan, how much do you weigh? And Wally, how much are you weigh? And that,
God.
yeah, cut. And the other, we were at the Dykeman Hotel for a long time before we moved to the Shallard Tower. And the day we were moving, we're carrying things in and out of the office, and I see Wally down in front of the safe. And I said, Wally, what are you doing? He said, well, I can't find the combination to the safe. So he's looking through the thing, and I come back through again, and I said, oh, Wally, you found the combination. Oh, yeah, then, pal. I said, well, what's in the safe? I don't know. He said the safe was on the other wall and they moved it, so I don't know what's left and what's right.
Gary, so, you obviously would have grown up with the AWA when your dad was directing and so forth. Let's get your insight about some Wally and Verne stories. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I started, my dad, as he had mentioned, produced and directed at the Callan Beach Hotel when I was growing up as a little kid. You talk about Lunch with Casey, that's a whole nother segment. But I would go hang out down at the TV studio at Callan Beach Hotel. I think I was 10 or 11 years old, and I started hustling cheeseburgers for the boys. There was a restaurant downstairs, and these guys would tip me out pretty good. And I was 10, 11 years old. You go pick up 40, 50 bucks back then. It was a lot of money. And so I got to know the boys. I got to know the studio. I was kayfabe then, but I kind of knew, at the point. But my first match was when we moved over to Golden Valley, Care 11 Studios, and Marty O'Neill was there, and he took a bad bump. And Wally came up to me and said, "Hey, throw the shirt on. You've been around long enough. Just go make it look like you know what you're doing." Mm-hmm. And at the time, my first match was Ken Patera. And I can't remember who he was wrestling, one of the guys from Milwaukee or whatever. And he told me what the finish was. And I said, okay. So then I started doing the match. And then I saw my dad walk out as I was refereeing. And that was mean to go home because they didn't smarten me up. We ended the match and Patera goes, "Here we go." And told me he was going to go into the finish. So I counted 1, 2, 3. And then my next match was Greg Gagne. And Greg Gagne tried to kayfabe everybody. And so I went up to Greg and I said, "The sleeper?" He goes, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Your finish is the sleeper, right?" He goes, "I don't know what you're talking about." So then we get into the match and he puts the sleeper on and I go, raise the arm, 1, 2, 3, ring the bell. And I said, "I told you, Greg." I go, "I've been around a lot longer than you think." And so those were my 2 first matches, but it was Wally that came to me and threw me Marty O'Neill's shirt and said, "Get in the ring." And I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And I did my last match, I think you were around, Joe, what, 5, 6 years ago? At age 60, I could probably still get in there and get it done.
As good as any.
As far as Verne, the word perfection is a little bit kind. I mean, either you had to do it his way, and you say, okay, back then we used to say, okay, Verne, we came up with this idea, and then about 10, 15 minutes later, he'd come back, "Hey, I got an idea." And you're going, "Oh, wow, Verne, that's awesome. What, how'd you come up with that?" And my dad and I would just sit there and laugh at each other. And, we worked Verne to get done what we thought was creative and something new to bring to the table. So Wally, you could go on about Wally. We would take 4 weeks to get through all that. But I was very privileged and honored to be able to work with my dad side by side for all those years. And what he didn't bring up is that we had what we called assured promotions. So not only did he ring announce, produce, and direct, and I refereed, but the one year Al DeRusha and Roger Kent had what they called assured promotions, our name backwards. At the time, I think we were PWP, Pro Wrestling Promotions. And we brought to a lot of communities professional wrestling, because the boys were sitting around during the week and not making any money. And so Roger Kent and my dad ended up doing, the one year we did over 93 specific towns, Sioux Falls, Mankato, Fargo, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, WEAU TV. We did all these communities, and we were packing the house. I mean, we sold out the Rochester Mayo Clinic constantly, and then we ended up later in life, Joe, as you remember, or I think you were around at the time, we used to do our television show down at the Mayo Clinic.
Mayo Civic Arena.
What's that?
Mayo Civic Arena.
Mayo Civic Arena. Thank you. So, we could sit here and talk, but, that's how I broke into the business. And then we can talk later about going to the WWE. But at the end of the day, I went to the WWE, and then I came back and helped. That's when I kind of met you, Joe. We started the ESPN, and, we brought the AWA back to life again on a major network. And we could go on and on about that. But at the end of the day, the AWA was the breeding ground for a lot of professional wrestlers. And, Verne Gagne, you could tell story upon story of all the boys that went out to his wrestling camp. As my dad said, he was an Olympic wrestler, but he was a shooter in camp. You had to do, there's guys that went through 2-3 times and he wouldn't take them on. Completely different than what the WWE does now, but this was a shoot camp. Ric Flair went through it. Sergeant Slaughter at the time was Super Destroyer. Yeah. And so these guys, Kurt Hennig, they all went, Ric Flair, they all went through this camp. And if you didn't pass and you didn't know how to work, it was a shoot. And then they got into the theatrics, and then finally Brad Ringens took over, and he had his wrestling camp, and he went on to teach just like Verne did, and ended up teaching a lot of the Japanese wrestlers right here in Minneapolis. And so the condition of these guys back then was unbelievable, because Verne was to that word, I guess we're catching on to, was perfection.
Mm-hmm.
Joel, you mentioned Lunch with Casey, the #1 rated kid show on television at the time. I also did like Popeye and Pete with Dave Lee and Sergeant Scotty, Outpost 11. We can go on and on. But Roundhouse had a limited prop closet. And the Crusher, before he would do his interviews, he'd say, "Hey, Al, let's go and look at the prop closet." And I said, "Okay." So we went in and excuse me, from Romper Room, we had an opening on the show with a Jack in the Box. So the Crusher takes the Jack in the Box. He comes on for an interview, and he's turning and he's singing. The Crusher chased at that time. Crusher called Bobby Heenan the Weasel. That's how that whole thing started. And the Crusher would sing. The Crusher chased the Weasel around the ringside, and pop goes the Weasel. And that's how that actually started. And it went on from there, and they had a Weasel match, and Bobby lost, and Wally's brother was a tailor, and he made the Weasel suit, and the rest was history. When we were in one of my promotions in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and Bobby said, "Oh yeah, Eau Claire, Wisconsin." He said, "It's so small. They have Baskin and Robbins only has 2 flavors, and
the town's so small. If you fall down, you're halfway out of it."
Yeah, and the town is so small that you are entering and you are leaving on the same sign. And Bobby King, he had the greatest sense of humor. He was so quick with his comebacks, but he would insult, the town, and then we would go there, and I would introduce Bobby, and I would say, and the manager, Bobby, the brain, Heenan, and he'd go, he'd get all excited. I don't want these farmers calling me the Weasel. If they call me the Weasel, I'm not going to wrestle, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm doing the ring announcing, and I'd say, "Hey, please don't call him the Weasel." So Bobby would turn his back to go to the corner, and I'd go like this to the fans, "Weasel, Weasel." And he'd get all excited and come running to me, and I'd say, "Please don't call him the Weasel." And he'd turn, "Weasel, Weasel." We did that in every town. It was, and Bobby would run out of the ring, and I'd say, "Okay, you got a 10 count to get into the ring." And he'd wait until about 7, 8, and he'd come running and jump in the ring. One other quick story about the Crusher. He was a tag team with Buck Rock and Roll Zumhoff. We were in New Ulm, Minnesota, the polka capital of the world. And Buck always came out with his, the rock and roll, that kind of
Boom
music.
box.
See, soothes my soul with a boombox.
Yep.
Well, Crusher on his interviews used to always say, it danced with the dollies around ringside. So I introduced the Crusher first. And then Buck, rock and roll, zoom off. And Buck came in, and instead of rock and roll music, he had a polka on there. Everybody went nuts. And the Crusher would grab the dollies around ringside and dance. And oh God, we would do things like that on the spot shows, and the Crusher, we all know, how great he was. He was from South Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Worked in the packing house, true. And he was just a great guy. At the end, he was in a senior home, senior care. And he and I would talk at least once a week and, talk about the old days. And he was a great guy. Great.
Yeah, I want to ask you, because you mentioned, spot shows. What about your relationship with Roger Kent and running spot shows with him?
Well, I knew Roger way back. He was had a outdoor hunting fishing show. He had a pilot license. He flew his own plane, and he'd go to a resort or fishing camp or something, and do a film and bring it back for on his show. And I directed his show for 4 or 5 years. And we were, pretty close friends. I remember the one time on the show, Roger was going to demonstrate how to portage with a canoe. And he picks up the canoe and puts it on his shoulders and falls on his keister on the air. Wally and I and Roger Kent went to the Wisconsin Governor's Fishing Open, and Roger brought up his boat that said Roger Kent, outdoor sportsman, and blah, blah, blah. And it was raining that day, and Wally and I and Roger spent a little too much time in the bar waiting for it to stop raining. And anyway, Roger said, God, I got to go and take some film of the governor for my show. And we did. We got in Roger's boat and went there, and there's the governor waiting for Roger, and he's waving, and Roger, so I said, Roger, is that film going to turn out? I asked him later. He said, I don't know. I didn't put the film in the damn camera. Roger, was in the Marine Corps and had his, what do they call it? Special forces or something like that. He produced a radio show when he was in the Marine Corps. And anyway, suffice to say, my relationship with Roger, and of course throughout the taping of wrestling and our promotions, and so we were together a lot of, many days. On our promotion, we would take turns. I would go to like Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and my son Glenn came along, and Gary came and refereed. My brother George sold tickets. It was kind of a family affair, if you will. And speaking of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the Crusher was the main event. I had all of the Mad Dog, Jesse Ventura, all the big names, Ric Flair, you name it. They, like Gary said earlier, they were only wrestling in the big major markets on the weekend, and I would book matches maybe 2-3 in a row in South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin. Anyway, we were in Eau Claire.
Yeah.
And that's up in Winnipeg, Canada. I had just got out of the hospital. I had back surgery, and that's when Gary took over to produce the shows. And they put me, this is in Winnipeg, and they were adjusting my back. But you can see Nick Bockwinkel, the Mad Dog, and Jerry Fatwell, and that was fun. But anyway, back to Eau Claire, it was a complete sellout, like almost all the time. But I'll say one thing about the Crusher. He went out in the parking lot and walked through all the fans, shaking their hands, thanking them for coming, and we'll see you next time. And Crush was great. He was great.
So we mentioned him a little bit earlier, and Al, I know that you go back with him, but I want to start with Gary on this one.
Sure.
The legendary AWA interviewer and announcer Marty O'Neill, fantastic athlete in his day. What do you remember about Marty O'Neill from those younger days, Gary?
Well, growing up, he would just, you talk about Mean Gene and the way he was able to keep the tempo. Back then, they would do interviews for each different, as my dad said, you'd make it localized, same matches, but you would do town after town after town. And my memory of Marty O'Neill was, well, first of all, we always say Marty O'Neill because of the Crusher. But when I was a little kid, I remember Marty O'Neill was interviewing. They were going to do an interview with Larry the Axe Henning at the time, and he was facing Dr. X. And Marty O'Neill came up with the idea. Again, one of the props, there was the ribbit. Was that the axe, or was that was the Crusher?
No, the ribbit was
Dick Byers,
Dr. X.
And Marty O'Neill said, well, no, and this was live. He said, we're going to put juice in the frog, and it was live. And all I had to do was, back to the weasel thing, is I had to come up. I was that little. I sat in there and I opened the hood. I went, ribbit, and I put it back down. And that was Marty O'Neill's idea, came up with that at that time. But when I was watching him, he constantly and consistently put everybody over.
Yep.
He never, he would make the leading questions, but he, on a consistent basis, he would, Mean Gene was awesome, but Mean Gene also learned from Marty O'Neill. And Marty O'Neill at the time was the perfect announcer because he was little, made the guys look bigger. And, he would just, no preconceived script, no nothing. He'd just go out there and get it done. And you can, Marty O'Neill was, you can't say, I was fortunate to be little and growing up around it. And that's what I remember was about him and his, his consistency and his professionalism to put everybody over.
Yeah. Well, Marty's thing was, it's all about the wrestler.
Right.
It's not about me. Yeah. The first time I met Marty was in October of 1953. He was doing the St. Paul Saints baseball. And back then, the announcers didn't travel with the league. They did the broadcast on ticker tape with sound effects records. And Marty would sit there and they had a bat hanging from the ceiling, and Marty would call the baseball, and you would think that he was right there at the park. He was a master at it. they would bring up sound effects, beer here, cold beer, and he would do the play-by-play, and when they had a hit, he would bang the bat with a little club. And anyway, I met Marty in 1953, and then when the AWA came to Channel 11, Marty was doing the wrestling. Just a little bit history of the AWA. It started back in the late 40s, early 50s on WCCO Channel 4. Then they moved to the Fauché Tower on Channel 9. And then from the Fauché Tower, they moved to the Calhoun Beach Hotel. That was in 1953. So it goes back a long ways.
Last Tuesday is kind of a blur to me, and he's talking about the 50s.
Well,
I wasn't even born yet.
I mean, and there's a lot of iconic, like what he's talking about.
I didn't mention the Sodbuster. I mean, when you think about it, you've probably read the stories. Patrick Royce did a real nice write-up on him, and he titled it "Sodbuster Kenny J Knew His Job and Did It Very Capably." And again, Marty O'Neill coined the phrase "capable Kenny J," and every wrestler that he faced on television, they would give something back to the Sodbuster. They didn't bury him and beat him up. They let him. He looked pretty good, and then of course the finish, he would he'd always lose, but everybody loved Kenny. In fact, he had his lawn service with his son, and he had the contract at the church right up here. And every time I'd go, like twice a week, he'd be out there cutting the grass and hay. He was a great guy. So I had to get that in.
And well deserved for Kenny. Again, I mean, we're talking about earlier, just what a sad period of time in last week or a couple of weeks ago from when you'll see this podcast. But yeah, we're losing them too quick. But let's get back on a brighter note.
Follow up on Kenny J.
Sure.
The big thing, and his highlight in his whole career was when he went to Chicago for the Muhammad Ali deal. Wally, myself, Kenny J, and they brought Bobby Heenan in too to do interviews the way he would do it and promote the matches. But we were at the Chicago Amphitheater, and Muhammad Ali arrives with his entourage, and they had big high doors where you could come in the basement of the building. Anyway, in comes three limos. The one front limo, guys got out looking around. Middle one, out comes Muhammad Ali, and the one in the back, he had bodyguards. But Muhammad came into the dressing room, and he was one of the biggest wrestling fans. He spent, I bet he spent an hour and a half talking with all the wrestlers and talking with Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan, and he was just a great guy.
Well, he watched a lot of wrestling interviews to be able to create a character for himself and be able to talk
Right.
and do his own interviews. That's where he picked it up from.
Yeah, with who was the guy before Jesse?
Superstar Billy Graham.
Superstar Billy Graham.
Superstar Billy Graham. You know, he did all that, and Muhammad picked up on that. About 2 weeks after Chicago, my wife and I were in Las Vegas at a lounge show, and the guy that did Blueberry Hill, and what the heck is
Blueberry Hill?
Pat's Domino.
Ain't That a Shame? Blueberry Hill.
Pat's
See, I'm going
Domino.
back. You guys are too young. Anyway, he said, a very good friend of mine is here tonight, and I want to recognize him. And they turned the house lights on, and it was Muhammad Ali and his people, and they were sitting right behind me. And Muhammad's advance man, but Al, hey, it was less than 2 weeks. He said, come on up after the show here, and you know, you and your wife are welcome. We went up to Muhammad's suite, and there he was, tending bar and laughing and having a great time. And he recalled Chicago, and what a great treat to meet all the wrestlers. And my wife and I, Marlene, we stayed for a couple of drinks. I didn't want to wear out my welcome, so we took off, you know, and that was a great. And I should have got his autograph, and I didn't.
Well, there's, you know, we as we progress through the time in the AWA, we've got Marty O'Neill and Roger Kent. There's another gentleman who did all right for himself. And Al, you had a very big hand in him starting his professional wrestling career. In the early days, he was known as Gene Leader.
Oh, Gene Leader.
But we know him as Gene Okerlund. Tell the story about how you helped train Mean Gene Okerlund.
My last 5 years at Channel 11, I was in sales, selling television time. Account executive was the big deal. Anyway, Gino came from what? WDGY. WDGY. He
Gene
was
Leader.
a disc jockey, and he had the drive time, and you're heading home with your leader, Gene, you know, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So he came to Channel 11, and he had some experience selling radio time. Anyway, make a long story short, he joined the sales team, and he and I were, well, my kids and his kids all grew up together.
Todd and Tor.
Yeah, and the station went on strike, the announcers. And Marty O'Neill, of course, was a union member, and Roger Kent was a union member. And Verne came to me and said, geez, Al, I got to get somebody to do the interviews. And I said, I got the guy for you. Who? I said, Gene Okerlund. Gene Okerlund. He said, well, yeah, isn't he a disc jockey or whatever? Okay. So he said, does he know anything about wrestling? I said, he doesn't need to know a whole hell of a lot about wrestling. The guy is short, you know, in stature, like Marty O'Neill, got a great voice like Roger Kent. And so I went up to Gene's cabin up northern Minnesota, and we spent the weekend rehearsing, doing interviews, you know, whatever. And Gene would stand in front of the the mirror and do his facial, whatever. Anyway, he made it. He was different than Marty. As we said earlier, Marty said the main attraction or the main in the interview is the wrestler, where Gene would, insert some whatever humor, and it was Jesse Ventura who named him Mean Gene Okerlund. But anyway, that's the story about Gino. That's how he started. I got him started in wrestling, and the rest is history. And
it's easy to say, and I think much like we were talking about Verne and perfection, and maybe perfection wasn't the optimal word for Verne. A character for Mean Gene Okerlund might be an understatement. Gary, you had plenty of opportunities to work with Gene, and I know you've got stories.
Well, the ones that we can share, or the ones that
exactly. So if you
got a lot of stories that I don't think people would believe, but
take us home on this episode.
When my dad got injured, and you saw the picture, and I was always at the studio, I then became the producer and I learned from my dad, so obviously I knew what I was doing. And we would do the interviews over at Channel 9 over on York Avenue, which is no longer there, and now Fox 9. But we would go over there on Tuesdays. And again, we had the backdrop, and we had Gene Okerlund was there. And we he was the new generation of Marty O'Neill, if you will.
Right.
He brought, as my dad said, he did a lot of, interacting with them, but it was the start of the entertainment was the interviews. And Gene did, the Massa Saito interviews, the famous interview of him trying on Andre the Giant's coat. That was never planned or talked about. Okerlund was talking to Andre, and Andre was telling him, how big he was. And out of the blue, Okerlund says, "Hey, well, do you mind if I try on your jacket?" And he put it on, and it draped over him like, a tarp. And we used that video forever. And then when later on in time, one of the best interviews he did that was non-scripted, just went out there and did it. My dad and Mad Dog were in the back room of Channel 9, and it was the death match between Mad Dog and Jerry Blackwell. Jerry Fatwell. This is the death match. And then so Mad Dog and my dad put together, props. There was some, plywood, and we lined up paint on the back of the door. And Gino came in, Okerlund came in after we had it set, and Mad Dog was there banging on the table. And it was probably one of the most classic interviews you'll ever see. And I know it's out there, Joe. Probably.
Well, I've got a copy of it.
But that was Okerlund just, bringing out the entertainment based off of what my dad and Mad Dog talked about. Again, Verne wasn't around, so we didn't have to ask permission. We just did it. I'll beg for forgiveness, not permission. And again, one of the most classic interviews you'll ever see back in the time. And Gino made it sound like he was walking down and found him in the dungeon. And it's a classic interview. So Okerlund too had that momentum, and he had that, that professionalism to stay there. We would record for, all day long, and we'd take a lunch break. But Okerlund was, these guys get to get off the set and rest for a minute, until they come up again. But Okerlund was there constantly. You couldn't smoke in the studio, but we kind of made it okay. And then right behind the stage, or right behind the flat, we had a little stand with Okerlund's cigarettes, and we got permission from the studio. We're going to be here all day, and we're renting the place, and we want one guy to be able to smoke. And so Okerlund, between the sets, he'd take a couple of drags, put it out, get back on, I mean, he would go nonstop.
Yeah, I call him Mean Gene, the interview machine. I believe we were like in 22 or 24 markets, and we had to do 4 interviews with each wrestler for each market. So we would start early in the morning, and like Gary said, you go all day long. And Gino just, well, Gary mentioned a couple of drags on a cigarette, and Gino sometimes had a couple of drags on something else, but
We'll leave that go.
yeah, that kept them going.
Kept them going.
We talked about the Andre the Giant, when he would come in for the Battle Royals, and he would, hit every major market. But I was fortunate enough to have him on a couple of my promotions, the bigger venues, and we would have Andre and a battle royal. Verne had a friend who was a coach at the high school in near Waverly. I'm trying to think of the name of the town.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'll come up with it.
Yeah. The Giant would ride with me to some of my towns where he was booked. And we were coming through Waverly, Minnesota, and the Giant was out of beer. And, hey, boss, he called everybody boss. We got to stop for a beer. I said, okay, well, so we went and stopped. It was in January, cold, and wind was blowing and snowing. And we pulled into the municipal liquor store, and the Giant comes in. Andre, all he ever wore was a sport coat, he and Mad Dog. And you can imagine it's like about 11:30, quarter to 12, and the door opens up and the snow and the wind. And there were some people in the bar, of course, and it was like a scene out of a John Wayne movie. And everybody, Andre, the bartender, Andre, the Giant. Oh my God, he couldn't believe it. And so the Giant says, hey, boss, I'll have a beer and a shot of Courvoisier, because that's what he always drank, And then finally he says to the bartender, hey, I want a case of beer. And he said, oh, gee, he said, I Minnesota, you can't sell beer after 10 o'clock. Oh, all right, okay, blah, blah, blah. So, the fans that were in there would buy an Andre a drink. And anyway, make a long story short, the bartender says, what are you driving? And I said, that International Scout out there. Oh, okay. So we get ready to leave, and we walk out. We'd get to my car, and the Giant gets in, and there on the front seat of the car is a case of beer. So from Waverly to the Dykeman Hotel, that's where Andre stayed, he drank that whole case of beer. And I don't think it's maybe an hour and a half,
if that.
If that.
Wow.
The beer was gone.